When Sarah Martinez walked into the emergency room that night, covered in mud and carrying an unconscious stranger, nobody believed her story. The small-town nurses whispered among themselves, how could this quiet librarian with no medical training possibly save someone who had been underwater for nearly 8 minutes? The doctors shook their heads, certain that her account was exaggerated, that luck alone had played the biggest role. But what they didn't know was that Sarah carried secrets from a past she had buried deep. Hidden beneath her gentle demeanor and soft-spoken nature was training that most people couldn't even imagine. Years of specialized military knowledge that she thought she'd never need again suddenly became the difference between life and death. This is the true story of how one woman's hidden past collided with an impossible moment, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes carry the most extraordinary skills. It's about the power of knowledge kept secret, the strength found in unexpected places, and how one night changed everything for two complete strangers whose lives became forever intertwined. Nobody expected her to succeed. Everyone was wrong. Sarah Martinez had spent the last 5 years perfecting the art of being invisible. In the small town of Cedar Falls, she was known as the quiet librarian who always had a warm smile and never caused any trouble. She lived in a modest apartment above the old bakery on Main Street, drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, and kept to herself in the way that made neighbors feel comfortable but never curious. Every morning at exactly 7:15, Sarah would walk the 6 blocks to the Cedar Falls Public Library, her leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder and a travel mug of coffee warming her hands. She would unlock the heavy oak doors, switch on the lights, and begin her day surrounded by the familiar smell of old books and fresh cleaning supplies. The routine was comforting, predictable, and exactly what she needed. The townspeople saw her as someone who had always been there, though in reality, she had only arrived in Cedar Falls 5 years earlier with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to start over. She had applied for the librarian position the day after seeing the posting online, and when Mrs. Henderson, the head of the library board, had interviewed her, Sarah had been careful to mention only her degree in literature and her love of books. She never talked about the years before, and nobody asked. At the library, Sarah excelled at helping children find the perfect adventure story and assisting elderly patrons with large print mysteries. She organized reading clubs, managed the computer lab with patience, and had single-handedly modernized the entire catalog system. The mayor often bragged about their dedicated librarian at town meetings, and Sarah would smile politely whenever anyone complimented her work. But, late at night, alone in her apartment, Sarah sometimes caught herself automatically checking the locks twice, scanning the street below before closing the curtains, and sleeping with one ear always listening. These habits felt strange now in the safety of Cedar Falls, but they were so deeply ingrained that she couldn't shake them even after years of peaceful small-town life. Her apartment was decorated simply, with comfortable furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. To any visitor, it would look like the home of someone who had always lived a quiet, academic life. But, hidden in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, wrapped in an old towel, was a small collection of items that told a very different story. A military compass that still worked perfectly. A knife with a worn handle that had saved her life more than once. A set of dog tags that she couldn't bring herself to throw away but couldn't bear to look at either. Sarah had chosen Cedar Falls specifically because it was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. The biggest excitement in recent memory had been when the high school basketball team made it to the state championships 2 years ago. Crime was practically non-existent, medical emergencies were usually handled by the capable team at Cedar Falls General Hospital, and the volunteer fire department rarely dealt with anything more serious than a cat stuck in a tree. She had built relationships carefully and deliberately, always friendly but never too close. Mrs. Patterson next door knew that Sarah liked her morning coffee strong and her evening tea with honey, but she didn't know that Sarah could field strip a rifle in under 2 minutes. Tom at the gas station always waved when she filled up her car, but he had no idea that she automatically memorized the license plates of every vehicle in the lot. The teenagers who came to the library after school for homework help saw her as a patient teacher, not someone who could navigate by the stars or survive in the wilderness for weeks with minimal supplies. This careful distance wasn't born from unfriendliness but from necessity. Sarah had learned the hard way that some parts of the past were better left buried, and she had worked too hard building this new life to risk it by getting too close to anyone. She attended community events, contributed to local charities, and participated just enough in town life to be considered a good neighbor without becoming the subject of too much attention or curiosity. The only person who suspected there was more to Sarah's story was Dr. James Reeves, the emergency room physician at Cedar Falls General Hospital. They had met during her first month in town when she had brought in Mrs. Henderson after the elderly woman had fallen at the library. Something about the way Sarah had assessed the injury, the calm precision with which she had provided information to the medical staff, had struck him as unusual for a civilian. But, when he had casually asked about any medical training, Sarah had simply said she had taken a first aid course once and changed the subject. Dr. Reeves had dropped the matter, but he continued to notice things about Sarah during their occasional interactions around town. The way she carried herself with a subtle alertness that most people lacked. How her eyes automatically surveyed any room she entered, noting exits and potential hazards. The fact that she never seemed startled by sudden noises or movements. These were small things that probably no one else noticed, but, to someone with his medical background and experience working with veterans, they painted a picture of someone with significant training or experience in high-stress situations. Still, Sarah's secret remained safe. She had become exactly what she had set out to be, an ordinary small-town librarian with an ordinary small-town life. She had successfully buried Lieutenant Sarah Martinez of the U.S. Army Special Forces, along with all the specialized knowledge and traumatic memories that came with that identity. Or at least, she thought she had. On the evening of October 15th, as Sarah was preparing to close the library after a particularly quiet day, she had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. The skills she had spent 5 years trying to forget were about to become the most important things she had ever learned. The careful, invisible life she had built was about to be shattered by a moment that would prove some knowledge can never truly be buried, only waiting for the right moment to resurface. As she turned off the lights and locked the library doors that night, Sarah was still the quiet librarian that Cedar Falls had come to know and appreciate. By morning, the entire town would see her in a completely different light, and there would be no going back to the safety of her carefully constructed anonymity. The transformation was less than 12 hours away, though Sarah had no warning of what was coming. She simply drove home through the quiet streets, heated up leftover soup for dinner, and settled in with a mystery novel, believing that tomorrow would be just another ordinary day in her ordinary life. She couldn't have been more wrong. The storm hit Cedar Falls just after midnight, bringing with it the kind of rain that turned peaceful streets into rushing streams and made driving treacherous for anyone brave enough to venture out. Sarah had been awakened by the thunder, and, after lying in bed listening to the wind howl around her building, she decided to make herself a cup of tea and read until the worst of it passed. She was curled up in her favorite chair by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, when she heard something that made her freeze. It was a sound that didn't belong with the natural chaos of the storm, the unmistakable crack of metal against rock, followed by a splash that seemed too loud and too close. Sarah set down her mug and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Cedar Falls was built along the banks of Miller Creek, which normally ran lazy and shallow through the center of town. But tonight, swollen by hours of heavy rain, the creek had become a raging torrent that had already overflowed its banks in several places. Sarah's apartment overlooked the section where the creek curved around behind the library, and, from her second-floor window, she had a clear view of the old stone bridge that connected the residential area to the main part of town. Lightning illuminated the scene just as Sarah pressed her face to the glass, and what she saw made her heart skip. A car had skidded off the rain-slick road and crashed through the bridge's safety barrier. The vehicle was now tilted at a dangerous angle, its front end submerged in the rushing water while its rear wheels still clung to the collapsed section of guardrail. For a moment, Sarah stood paralyzed, her mind racing through possibilities. The smart thing to do would be to call 911 and let the professionals handle it. The volunteer fire department would respond as quickly as they could, and the paramedics would be right behind them. But, even as she reached for her phone, Sarah realized with growing horror that the car was sliding further into the water with each passing second. By the time help arrived, it would be too late. Without allowing herself to think about what she was doing, Sarah grabbed the emergency kit she kept in her hall closet. It was a habit from her military days that she had never been able to break, keeping supplies ready for situations that her civilian life was never supposed to encounter. She pulled on waterproof boots and a rain jacket, stuffed a flashlight and rope into her pockets, and ran down the stairs and out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, soaking through her jacket within seconds despite its waterproof claims. The wind was strong enough that she had to lean into it to make forward progress, and the sound of the rushing water grew louder with each step toward the creek. As she got closer to the bridge, Sarah could see that the situation was even worse than it had appeared from her window. The car was a small sedan that had obviously been traveling too fast for the conditions when it hit the curve. The impact with the barrier had crumpled the hood and shattered the windshield, and now the entire front half of the vehicle was underwater. Through the driver's side window, Sarah could make out the silhouette of a person slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. Every instinct she had developed during 5 years of civilian life screamed at her to wait for help, to not get involved, to protect the carefully constructed anonymity that had become her safety net. But, stronger than those instincts was the training that had been drilled into her during years of military service. When someone's life was at stake, you acted. You used whatever skills you had, and you worried about the consequences later. Sarah quickly assessed the situation with the tactical mindset she thought she had buried forever. The car was approximately 15 feet from the bank, sitting in water that was probably 4 to 5 feet deep and moving fast enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing. The rear of the vehicle was supported by the twisted remains of the guardrail, but that wouldn't hold for long as the metal continued to bend under the combined weight of the car and the pressure of the water. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the car was completely submerged, and that was an optimistic estimate. There was no time to wait for professional rescue equipment or backup. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Sarah tied one end of her rope around a sturdy oak tree that grew near the bank, then secured the other end around her waist with a bowline knot that would hold under pressure but could be released quickly if necessary. The knot was tied with the automatic precision of someone who had practiced it thousands of times, though she hadn't consciously remembered the technique in years. She entered the water slowly, testing each step as the current tried to pull her downstream. The creek bottom was treacherous with loose rocks and debris carried by the flood, and she had to fight to maintain her balance as she worked her way toward the car. The cold was shocking, numbing her hands and feet within seconds, but she forced herself to focus on the task ahead. When she reached the vehicle, Sarah could see that the situation was even more dire than she had feared. The driver was a man, probably in his 30s, unconscious and barely breathing. Water was already seeping into the car through the damaged windshield, and it was rising quickly. She estimated that he had maybe 5 minutes before the water level reached his head. The driver's side door was jammed shut by the impact, and Sarah quickly realized that trying to force it open would waste precious time and might destabilize the car's precarious position. Instead, she moved to the passenger side, where the door had been thrown open during the crash. She took a deep breath and submerged herself to squeeze through the partially flooded opening. Inside the car, the situation was chaotic. The man was held in place by his seatbelt, but his head had struck the steering wheel hard enough to leave him unconscious. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and Sarah could see that he had sustained significant injuries beyond the obvious head trauma. There was blood on his forehead, and the way his left arm hung suggested a possible fracture or dislocation. Working in the confined space of the flooding car, Sarah quickly assessed his condition using skills that came back to her as naturally as breathing. She checked his pulse, which was weak but steady, and gently examined his head wound to determine the extent of the damage. The cut was deep but not life-threatening, and, while he likely had a concussion, there were no obvious signs of a skull fracture. But, even as she worked, Sarah could feel the car shifting beneath her. The water level was rising rapidly, and the twisted guardrail that was supporting the rear of the vehicle was making ominous creaking sounds as it bent further under the strain. She had perhaps 2 minutes to get the man out before they were both trapped in a submerged car. Sarah unclipped the man's seatbelt and carefully maneuvered him toward the passenger side door. His unconscious weight made the task incredibly difficult in the confined space, especially with water now reaching their chests. She had to be cautious not to aggravate any potential spinal injuries while still moving quickly enough to get them both to safety. As she struggled to position the man for extraction, Sarah's military training took over completely. The careful, quiet librarian disappeared, replaced by someone who had been trained to operate under extreme pressure and make life or death decisions with limited information. Her movements became efficient and purposeful, guided by muscle memory and instincts that had been honed through years of specialized training. Just as she managed to get the man's upper body through the passenger door opening, the guardrail gave way completely. The car tilted forward sharply, throwing Sarah off balance and threatening to trap them both as the vehicle began its final descent into the rushing water. With only seconds to spare, she grabbed the man under his arms and used every ounce of strength she had to pull him free from the sinking car. The current immediately tried to sweep them both downstream, but Sarah's rope held firm. She wrapped one arm around the unconscious man's chest and used her free hand to pull them both toward the bank, fighting against the powerful flow of the flood-swollen creek. Her boots slipped repeatedly on the rocky bottom, and the cold was making her muscles cramp, but she refused to let go. By the time they reached the safety of the bank, Sarah was exhausted and shivering uncontrollably. The man was still unconscious, his breathing even more labored than before, and she knew that getting him out of the water was only the first step. Now she had to keep him alive until professional help could arrive, and that meant using knowledge that would reveal exactly who she really was. Once on solid ground, Sarah quickly dragged the unconscious man away from the water's edge and positioned him on a relatively flat section of grass behind the library. The rain continued to pour down, but she managed to find some shelter under the building's overhang. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone to call 911, but her voice was steady and clear as she reported the situation to the dispatcher. "I need an ambulance at the Miller Creek Bridge behind the public library," she said, automatically providing precise location details and a preliminary assessment of the victim's condition that surprised even her with its clinical accuracy. Adult male, approximately 35 years old, unconscious with head trauma and possible internal injuries. He was submerged for approximately 6 to 8 minutes before extraction. Breathing is shallow and irregular, pulses weak but present. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but, with the storm causing problems throughout the county, the earliest arrival time would be 15 to 20 minutes. Sarah looked down at the man lying motionless beside her and realized that 20 minutes might be too long. His breathing had become increasingly labored, and his skin was taking on a bluish tint that she recognized as a sign of insufficient oxygen. Without hesitation, Sarah's training took over completely. She positioned the man's head to clear his airway, a procedure she performed with the kind of precision that comes from extensive practice. She checked for obstructions in his mouth and throat, then began the systematic assessment process that she had learned during her years as a combat medic with the Special Forces. The head wound, while bloody, was not the primary concern. Sarah could tell from the way the man was breathing that he likely had water in his lungs from his time submerged in the creek. His breathing pattern and the sound of his respiration indicated possible pulmonary edema, a condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs and prevents proper oxygen exchange. Without immediate intervention, he could die from drowning even though he was no longer in the water. Sarah carefully positioned the man on his side in the recovery position, angling his body so that any water in his lungs could drain out naturally. She monitored his breathing closely, ready to perform rescue breathing if necessary, while keeping constant watch on his pulse and general condition. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these procedures countless times under far worse conditions than a rainy night in a small town. As she worked, memories of her military service came flooding back with startling clarity. She remembered the intensive medical training she had received as part of her Special Forces preparation, the countless hours spent learning to treat everything from gunshot wounds to chemical exposure in battlefield conditions. She recalled the missions where these skills had meant the difference between life and death for her teammates, and the weight of responsibility that came with being the person others counted on when everything went wrong. The man's breathing gradually became less labored as the water drained from his lungs, but he remained unconscious. Sarah continued her assessment, carefully checking for signs of spinal injury and other trauma that might not be immediately obvious. She found what appeared to be bruising on his ribs, suggesting possible internal injuries, and his left shoulder was clearly dislocated from the impact of the crash. Using techniques she hadn't employed in 5 years, Sarah fashioned a makeshift splint from materials she found nearby, immobilizing the man's injured arm to prevent further damage. She used her own jacket as additional insulation to help maintain his body temperature, which was critically important given his prolonged exposure to cold water. Every action was performed with the kind of systematic thoroughness that had been drilled into her during military medical training. As she continued to monitor his vital signs, Sarah found herself slipping back into the mindset that had defined her previous life. She became completely focused on the task at hand, automatically prioritizing threats and solutions, maintaining constant situational awareness even while concentrating on her patient. The quiet, reserved librarian was gone, replaced by someone who had been trained to save lives under impossible circumstances. When the ambulance finally arrived, followed closely by the fire department and police, Sarah was ready with a complete report of the man's condition and the treatment she had provided. The paramedics, expecting to find a civilian who had simply pulled someone from the water, were clearly surprised by the professional quality of care their patient had received. "Who provided the initial treatment?" asked Emma Rodriguez, the lead paramedic, as she quickly assessed the man's condition and began preparing him for transport. "I did," Sarah replied simply, but Emma's follow-up questions revealed that Sarah's medical knowledge went far beyond basic first aid. "You mentioned possible pulmonary edema and internal trauma. What's your medical background?" Emma asked as she and her partner worked to stabilize the patient. Sarah hesitated for a moment, realizing that her carefully maintained cover was already blown. There was no way to explain her level of knowledge and competence without revealing at least part of her military background. "I was a combat medic," she said finally, the first time she had spoken those words aloud since arriving in Cedar Falls. The effect was immediate. Emma and her partner exchanged glances that conveyed both respect and curiosity, while the police officers who had arrived to investigate the accident began to look at Sarah with new interest. Word spread quickly among the first responders that the quiet librarian had turned out to be someone with serious medical training and the skills to back it up. Dr. James Reeves arrived at the scene just as the paramedics were loading the patient into the ambulance. He had been called in due to the severity of the case, and his presence meant that he witnessed firsthand Sarah's interaction with the medical team. The calm, professional way she communicated with the paramedics, the precise medical terminology she used, and the obvious respect the emergency personnel showed for her assessment all confirmed his long-standing suspicions that there was much more to Sarah Martinez than met the eye. As the ambulance pulled away with its patient, Dr. Reeves approached Sarah, who was standing in the rain looking drained and somehow smaller than she had appeared while taking charge of the medical emergency. "That was impressive work," he said quietly. "Combat medic, huh? I had a feeling there was more to your story." Sarah looked at him warily, uncertain how much to reveal. 5 years of careful secrecy had just been undone in a single night, and she wasn't sure how to handle the exposure. "It was a long time ago," she said finally. "Skills like that don't just disappear," Dr. Reeves observed. "From what I saw, you likely saved that man's life. The water in his lungs alone could have killed him if you hadn't known how to handle it properly." By the time Sarah made it back to her apartment, she was emotionally and physically exhausted. But even as she changed into dry clothes and tried to process what had happened, she knew that her life in Cedar Falls would never be the same. The careful anonymity she had cultivated was gone, replaced by questions and attention that she had spent 5 years trying to avoid. The man she had rescued, whose name she learned was David Chen, a traveling salesman who had been caught in the storm while driving through town, was alive and stable thanks to her intervention. But the cost of saving his life was the exposure of secrets she had hoped to keep buried forever. As Sarah finally collapsed into bed as dawn was breaking, she had no idea that this was only the beginning of how dramatically her life was about to change. News travels fast in a small town, especially news as dramatic as the quiet librarian turning out to be a military-trained lifesaver. By the next morning, Sarah would discover that her heroic actions had made her the center of attention in a way that threatened everything she had worked to build in Cedar Falls. The question now was whether she could find a way to manage the consequences of her good deed without losing the new life she had fought so hard to create. Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside her apartment building, an unusual occurrence in the normally quiet residential area behind the library. When she looked out her window, she was shocked to see a small crowd gathered on the street below, including several people she recognized from town along with others she had never seen before. One man was holding what appeared to be a professional camera, while a woman with perfectly styled hair was speaking into a microphone. The story of her rescue had apparently spread far beyond Cedar Falls. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that the last thing she wanted had happened. She had become news. The careful, anonymous life she had built was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. Her phone had been ringing almost constantly since dawn, calls from numbers she didn't recognize mixed with concerned messages from people in town who had heard about the previous night's events. Sarah ignored them all, instead calling the library to let them know she wouldn't be in due to illness. It wasn't entirely untrue, the stress of her sudden exposure was making her feel genuinely sick. By mid-morning, the situation had grown worse. Sarah watched from her window as more reporters arrived, along with what appeared to be federal agents in dark suits who were asking questions of anyone willing to talk. The sight of government officials made her blood run cold. She had been so focused on keeping her military background secret from the townspeople that she hadn't considered the possibility that her actions might attract attention from her former employers. The knock on her door came just before noon. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw two people in military uniforms standing in the hallway outside her apartment. With a heavy sense of inevitability, she opened the door to find Major Patricia Williams and Captain Robert Nash, both wearing the insignia of Army intelligence. Lieutenant Martinez, Major Williams said formally, though her expression was not unkind. Or should I say, Ms. Martinez? May we come in? Sarah stepped aside to let them enter, her mind racing as she tried to figure out exactly how much trouble she was in. The Army had let her go with an honorable discharge 5 years ago, but her service record was classified at levels that made it legally complicated for her to discuss, even years later. "We're not here to cause problems for you," Captain Nash said as they settled in her small living room. "But your actions last night have raised some questions that need to be addressed." Major Williams opened a file folder and spread several photographs on Sarah's coffee table. To her shock, the images showed her in the water rescuing David Chen, taken from multiple angles that suggested sophisticated surveillance equipment had been watching the scene unfold. "These photos were taken by our monitoring station," Major Williams explained. "We've been keeping a loose watch on former Special Forces personnel in this region as part of a routine security protocol. When we reviewed the footage from last night, we realized we had witnessed something remarkable." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her recent dunking in the creek. "You've been watching me for 5 years?" "Not actively," Captain Nash assured her. "The monitoring station covers a wide area and tracks multiple individuals. Your file was flagged for periodic review, but you've done nothing to warrant active surveillance until now." Major Williams leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, we need to talk about your service record. Specifically, about the medical training you received during Operation Silent Thunder." The code name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Silent Thunder had been one of the most classified missions she had ever been part of, involving the infiltration of a hostile territory to extract a kidnapped diplomat. During that mission, she had been forced to perform emergency surgery on a wounded team member using techniques that went far beyond standard combat medic training. "I can't discuss that operation," Sarah said automatically, the security protocols still deeply ingrained after all these years. "Actually, you can now," Major Williams said, sliding another document across the table. "Your classification level has been revised due to changing circumstances. We need you to understand why your actions last night were significant beyond just saving a man's life." Captain Nash picked up the explanation. "The medical techniques you used on David Chen included procedures that are only taught in our most advanced combat medicine programs. Specifically, the way you handled the pulmonary edema and the field assessment protocols you followed are part of a specialized curriculum that has only been provided to a select group of Special Forces medics." Sarah began to understand where this was heading, and she didn't like it. "What does this have to do with anything? I saved someone's life using skills I learned in the military. Isn't that what training is for?" "Under normal circumstances, yes," Major Williams agreed. "But David Chen isn't just any civilian. He's a Chinese intelligence operative who was traveling under deep cover when he crashed his car last night." The revelation hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. The man she had risked everything to save, the person whose life had cost her 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity, was a foreign agent. The irony was so profound that for a moment she couldn't speak. Chen was being tracked by multiple agencies when the storm caused him to lose control of his vehicle, Captain Nash continued. His mission in the United States is still unclear, but preliminary intelligence suggests he was involved in industrial espionage targeting defense contractors in the region. So what are you telling me? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. We're telling you that by saving Chen's life, you may have inadvertently protected a valuable intelligence asset, Major Williams said. And, more importantly, you demonstrated skills and judgment under pressure that suggest you haven't lost any of your operational effectiveness despite 5 years of civilian life. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah could see where this conversation was leading, and every instinct told her to refuse whatever they were about to propose before they even said it. The intelligence community has been watching the situation with growing interest, Captain Nash said. Chen is expected to make a full recovery, thanks to your intervention, and, when he does, he's going to be in a unique position. He'll be grateful to the person who saved his life, potentially grateful enough to cooperate with questioning or even consider defection. And, you think he'll trust me because I pulled him out of a creek, Sarah said flatly. We think he'll trust you because you saved his life when you had no obligation to do so, and, because you did it with a level of skill that he'll recognize and respect, Major Williams corrected. Intelligence operatives are trained to assess people quickly, and what Chen experienced last night was professional-level emergency medical care provided by someone who put herself at significant risk to help a stranger. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the crowd of reporters and curious townspeople that had gathered because of her moment of heroism. The peaceful life she had built in Cedar Falls was already over, destroyed by a single night's decision to do the right thing. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said without turning around. We're asking you to visit Chen in the hospital, Captain Nash replied. As a concerned citizen checking on the man you rescued. If he's willing to talk, we'd like you to listen. If he's not, then no harm done and you go back to your life. Except I can't go back to my life, Sarah said, gesturing toward the window. It's gone. 5 years of anonymity destroyed because I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. Major Williams's voice was gentler when she responded. Sarah, you were never going to be able to hide who you are forever. Skills like yours, character like yours, it has a way of revealing itself eventually. The question now is whether you use what's happened to move forward or spend the rest of your life running from who you used to be. Sarah turned back to face them, knowing that her decision would determine not just her own future but, potentially the outcome of an international intelligence situation that had begun with a car crash in a small-town creek. The quiet librarian she had pretended to be was gone forever, but maybe it was time to stop pretending and figure out who Sarah Martinez was supposed to become next. The weight of the decision pressed down on her as she realized that everything was about to change again, whether she wanted it to or not. The past she had tried to bury was demanding to be acknowledged, and the skills she had attempted to forget were about to become the most important things she possessed once more. 3 days after the rescue, Sarah found herself walking through the corridors of Cedar Falls General Hospital, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the library's garden and wearing the kind of simple dress that any concerned citizen might choose for a hospital visit. But, beneath her civilian appearance, she was acutely aware of the small recording device hidden in her purse and the weight of the decision she had made. David Chen was awake when she arrived at his room, sitting up in bed and looking remarkably good for someone who had been underwater for 8 minutes just a few days earlier. He was younger than she had initially estimated, probably in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes that tracked her movement as she entered the room. There was something in his expression that suggested he had been expecting her visit. Ms. Martinez, he said in perfectly unaccented English, though she could detect the slight formality that suggested it wasn't his first language. I hoped I would have the opportunity to thank you personally. Sarah set the flowers on his bedside table and took the chair next to his bed, studying his face for signs of the injury she had treated. The head wound was healing well, and his color was good, showing no lingering effects from the water in his lungs. Her professional assessment was automatic, even though she was no longer officially qualified to make medical evaluations. How are you feeling? She asked, genuinely concerned despite the complicated circumstances surrounding his identity. Much better than I have any right to expect, Chen replied with a slight smile. The doctors tell me that someone with exceptional medical training provided emergency care at the scene. They said it probably saved my life. There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah suspect he knew more about her background than a random accident victim should. She studied his expression carefully, looking for the tells that might indicate whether he was simply grateful or actively gathering intelligence. "I'm glad you're recovering well," Sarah said simply. "It was a terrible night for anyone to be driving." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "I was foolish to be on the road in such weather. I was trying to reach my hotel before the storm got worse, but I underestimated how quickly conditions deteriorated." He paused, watching her face. "I understand you work at the library here in town." "That's right," Sarah confirmed, wondering where he was leading the conversation. "It's interesting," Chen said, settling back against his pillows. "In my country, we have great respect for librarians. They are seen as guardians of knowledge, people who preserve and protect important information. But your medical skills suggest you have protected more than just books in your lifetime." The comment was subtle but unmistakable. Chen was letting her know that he suspected her background without directly confronting her about it. Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who was exactly as intelligent and perceptive as the Army intelligence officers had suggested. "I took some medical training years ago," Sarah said, maintaining her cover story while watching for his reaction. "You never know when it might be useful." "Indeed," Chen agreed. "Though I suspect your training was more extensive than most civilian courses provide. The way you handled my breathing difficulties, the systematic assessment you performed, these are not techniques learned in a weekend first aid class." They looked at each other in silence for a moment, both clearly aware that they were dancing around topics that neither was supposed to discuss directly. Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "What were you really doing driving through Cedar Falls during a storm?" she asked quietly. Chen's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been respect. "I was traveling for business," he said simply. "Import-export consulting. Rather boring work, actually." "It must be very specialized consulting to require traveling in dangerous weather," Sarah observed. "Sometimes opportunities arise that require immediate attention," Chen replied. "Though obviously, I misjudged the risks involved." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "May I ask you something, Ms. Martinez?" "Of course. When you pulled me from that car, you had no idea who I was or what I might have done with my life. For all you knew, I could have been a criminal or someone who had caused harm to others. What made you decide to risk your own safety for a complete stranger?" The question caught Sarah off guard with its directness. She had expected him to probe her background or try to gather intelligence about her capabilities, but instead he was asking about her motivations. It was a more personal and, somehow more dangerous line of inquiry. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "Your life had value regardless of who you are or what you've done. In that moment, you were just someone who needed help." Chen studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "That's a remarkably principled position for someone with your obvious training and experience. In my line of work, people tend to calculate the risks and benefits before acting." "Maybe that's the difference between us," Sarah said. "Perhaps," Chen said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps we're more similar than either of us wants to admit. After all, you must have calculated the risks of coming here to visit me. A quiet librarian doesn't normally maintain contact with accident victims unless there's a particular reason." Sarah realized that Chen was much more dangerous than she had anticipated, not because he was threatening her physically, but because he was skilled at reading people and situations in ways that cut through deception. He was making it clear that he knew her visit wasn't purely humanitarian while simultaneously acknowledging that he understood the game they were both playing. "Maybe I just wanted to make sure you were okay," Sarah said. "And maybe I'm exactly what I appear to be," Chen replied with a slight smile. "A businessman who made a poor decision about travel timing and was fortunate enough to be rescued by someone with exceptional skills." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both understanding that they had reached an implicit agreement to maintain their respective cover stories while acknowledging the more complex realities underneath. Sarah found herself genuinely liking Chen despite the circumstances, and she suspected the feeling was mutual. "Ms. Martinez," Chen said finally, "I would like to repay your kindness somehow. Perhaps you would allow me to take you to dinner once I'm released from the hospital. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet meal where I can properly thank you for saving my life." The invitation was clearly more than social courtesy, but Sarah couldn't tell if it was an intelligence-gathering opportunity, a genuine expression of gratitude, or something else entirely. What she did know was that accepting would cross a line that would make it impossible to return to her former life, while declining might mean missing an opportunity to understand what Chen was really doing in the United States. "I'd like that," Sarah heard herself say, making a decision that she knew would change everything yet again. As she prepared to leave the hospital, Sarah realized that the woman who had entered David Chen's room was not the same person who was walking out. The careful balance she had tried to maintain between her past and present had finally collapsed completely, replaced by something new that she couldn't yet define. Outside the hospital, Major Williams was waiting in an unmarked sedan, ready to debrief her on the conversation. But, for the first time since the Army intelligence officers had appeared at her door, Sarah felt like she was in control of her own destiny rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond her influence. The quiet librarian was gone forever, but maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. As Sarah walked toward the car that would take her back into a world of secrets and complications, she realized that she was no longer running from who she used to be. Instead, she was finally ready to discover who she was meant to become. The story that had begun with a car crash and a storm had become something far more complex than a simple rescue. Sarah Martinez had saved a life, exposed her own secrets, and stepped into a new chapter that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. The only certainty was that there was no going back to the safety of anonymity she had once treasured. Whatever came next would require all the skills and courage that had defined her military service, combined with the wisdom and compassion she had discovered during her years as a small-town librarian. The future was uncertain, but, for the first time in 5 years, Sarah felt truly alive and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.